This is an updated video on how to do very basic shape building in Figma. They've just released some new features that make this much easier, so I recommend you do it this way. So if you've made it to exercise 2, you should be looking at a file like this, but you shouldn't be able to edit it. The very first thing to do is to make a copy of this file and put it in your own project. The way that you do that is to come up here next to the name, click the drop down, and select Duplicate. This will make a copy, and you'll want to move it into your own project. You can do that from the drop-down, move file. You'll switch over to the All tab. Ignore all the teams I have here. You should have Graphic Design 1. And then you can move it into your own drafts. If it's there, nobody else can see it. You don't want to put it in your drafts for group critique. You want to make your own project, select New Project, and you should name it with your name. This doesn't really matter whether or not other people can edit it. You can set this to view if you're worried about people poking around in it. But the main thing is to hit Create Project. This will give you your new project here, which is basically a folder. And once you hit Move, you'll see that this file is now moved into the project called My Name. So I'm going to rename this here. In order to navigate around here, I highly recommend that you use a mouse. But you can, underneath the Move tool, there's a hand tool, but this is really tedious. If you have a mouse, you can use the middle scroll wheel to click and drag. But there's an easier way. I really recommend you turn on a few settings up here from Figma. If you go to Preferences, the two things I recommend you make sure are checked are these two down here. Use scroll wheel to zoom, and right-click and drag to pan. What that lets us do is if I scroll up or down on my mouse, it lets me zoom in and out from the canvas, and I can use my right mouse button to click and drag around the screen. And that will make navigating just a lot easier. And now we're all set to work. So, a lot of the principles apply from Adobe Illustrator. Things are just a little bit different in Figma. So we're just going to go frame by frame and we're going to copy the directions here. One of the first things to note though is that you should always be working within a frame in Figma. So I could grab a rectangle tool and just throw this on here, but you'll notice over here in my layers panel, this rectangle is just kind of floating. It's not really on like a piece of paper. You can think about frames as containers or pieces of paper. To make one of those, you're going to grab the frame tool down here. I'm just going to start at the corner up here of the page, hold Shift to make sure this stays proportional. If you don't hold Shift, you can kind of freely transform this, but to keep a perfect square, I'm going to hold Shift. And you'll see I get a new frame over here. This is going to be helpful because it's going to help us organize our objects. The problem with this right now is we can't see the shape underneath. So we need to get rid of this background fill. Our fill is over here in the right-hand properties panel. This is our color, that's the fill. All the way over to the right, there is a minus sign. This will remove that color, but it will still keep the frame. So now we can work within our frame and we can still see what's underneath it. So let's make a square with a solid fill and no stroke. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool again, and now you'll see if I make my square, this rectangle shows up within the frame. So this helps us keep things organized. So for example, if I had a whole bunch of rectangles and I move the frame, they all move with it, which is really helpful. These files get messy easily, so it's important to keep them organized. Okay, next up is the circle with no fill and a solid stroke that's any color besides black. If we click and hold underneath our rectangle tool, you'll find the ellipse. And the ellipse regularly, or by default, you are clicking and dragging and it transforms from the top left corner. But usually when you're working with a circle, it's kind of easier to think about drawing it from the center. And the way that you can do that is if you hold Alt or Option, this will transform the shape from the center of wherever you clicked. So now I can click around the center of this circle, click and hold, and then if I push Alt, you'll see that the location of where that transform um, expands from changes to the center. And again, just like the rectangle, if I hold Shift, this will constrain it to be perfectly proportional. And this is a perfect circle. Next, we need to give it a solid stroke with any color besides black. So over here, just like with our frame, there's another section below fill called stroke. We can add a stroke by hitting plus, and then we can select whatever color we want this to be. I'm going to choose a bluish indigo. And then this icon here with the three rectangles is the stroke weight. If we increase that by clicking and dragging, or you can type a number in there, it increases the weight of the stroke. To get rid of the fill, just like with our frame, we hit minus. That gets rid of our frame. And we forgot to put this in a frame like our rectangle, so I'm just going to do that really quickly by clicking and dragging around our circle. And you can see over here in frame 2, Figma was smart enough to figure out that we wanted our ellipse to be within that frame. I'll go ahead and pull the fill off of that, and we're all done with that. Okay, next up, a triangle with a dashed stroke. Underneath our shapes here, we do have a polygon option, and a triangle is a polygon. If I hold Shift, that makes that. You can also increase or decrease the number of points in your polygon over here in Appearance. It's these 4 dots here. You'll see as I increase this changes the polygon that we're making. But a triangle has 3 points, so I will leave it on 3. I want to make sure this is in a frame. Keep forgetting to do that. And then we want to give this a dashed stroke. So we already know how to add a stroke. We use the plus down here. I'm going to increase the weight just so we can see it. And then we have more options, but you can't see them from the panel as it is now. You have to click these 2 sliders over here, Advanced Stroke Settings. And then we get more style options for our stroke. If we select solid, there's a drop down and we can change this to dashed. You get more options in here for kind of the spacing that you want between them, so you can play with these if you wanted to, but the default is just fine. Okay, pentagon. First up, I'm going to make my frame. We already know about our polygon tool, so I'll draw my triangle. And then again over here, I just need to increase the number of points, and now we have a pentagon. Next up, a quadrilateral. And there's a tip here that we can create this by narrowing the base by moving the points in. So this is where we need to start thinking about how do we go from these basic shapes to construct something a little more complex. So to start, we're actually going to start with a rectangle. So I'm going to click and drag up here, and then I'm going to move this over just so we can see. And really what this is it's a rectangle where these 2 bottom points are scooched in. The way that we do that in Figma is we have to get into Object Edit mode. There's 2 ways to do that. We can double click on our object, or if you have it selected, you can hit Enter, and you'll see that we get these diagonal lines over here. The other way to do that is if you have your object selected, up here in the Properties panel, underneath More Options, you can hit Edit Object, and that gets us to the same place. What this lets us do is select individual lines and points in our object, which is something that we can't do from the previous mode. Once we do that, you'll see that I can click on individual vertices or points in the object, and they turn this solid color. Once they do that, we can move that point. So I can click and hold and drag this over. You can constrain the direction that you're dragging these in to like snap to a common angle or a vertical or horizontal line by holding shift. It just makes things a little bit easier. And then to get out of object edit mode, you can just click out of it, or I believe we can hit enter. Yeah. Next up, we have our half circle. First, I'll make my frame. Oops. Remove that fill. And now we need to start thinking about shape building in terms of construction. So there is no half circle tool, but what I can do is use an ellipse and then cut part of it off with another shape. We can think about it kind of like a cookie cutter. So I'll start with a circle, and then I'm going to draw a rectangle. And I'm just going to change the color of this so we can see what we're doing. I could line this up and this should snap to the center of that circle, but I also want to show you how to select multiple objects and use alignment options. So right now I have my rectangle selected. I can also select the circle by holding shift, and then you'll see over here in my layers panel that both of those are selected at the same time. In the properties panel underneath position, we have options for alignment. If I use this second option here, align horizontal centers, that will shift those objects so that the horizontal centers are perfectly aligned. Now, we used to use the Pathfinder to do this. That's why that's this instruction up here. Up here underneath properties, you'll see this says union. There's a few different options for combining shapes. We could use subtract, which subtracts the top object from the object underneath it, and you'll see how that cuts the bottom half of the circle off. I'm going to undo that with Control Z, because now we have a little bit more of an intuitive way of doing this called the Shape Builder tool. So if I have both these objects selected, and then if I hit enter on my keyboard, we're going to go into that object edit mode. So now you'll see when I hover over things, I get those diagonal lines. This third option here, called the Shape Builder tool, lets us look at intersections of shapes. So right now, by default, it has this plus on it. So if I click and drag across different areas of my shapes, that will actually combine those into one object. But if I hold Alt or Option, that plus changes to a minus, and we can cut things out of other things. So if I drag across from left to right, just make sure I'm passing through the rectangle and the bottom half of the circle here. When I release my mouse, you'll see that that cut the bottom part of the circle off. And looks like we went a little bit beyond the half here, so what I'm going to do, hit escape to get out of our object edit mode. I had aligned the horizontal centers, but I didn't line this up with the vertical center here. So I'll just do that again, hit enter, go into my shape builder, hold Alt or Option, click and drag across, and then you'll see we have our half circle. We can do the same thing by cutting a circle out of a square. First, I'm going to make my frame, remove the fill. I'll start with a square. And then I'm going to put a circle on top of this. Change the color just so I can see it. And then I'm going to hold shift to select both of them. I will use my align horizontal centers, and then I'll select align vertical centers. And you'll see it moved those to put this perfectly in the center of the square. So we could use subtract from our Pathfinder options, or if you hit enter, you can use the Shape Builder tool, hold Alt, click, and cut that out of the center. Next up, we're going to learn how to edit the radius of points. So I'll make my frame for our square with a rounded corner, remove the fill. This again, you could do this with the pen tool, but it's much easier to think about whether or not you can construct this from basic shapes. Essentially, this is going to be a square. And then you can see when you hover over the corners of things, you get this radius. You can click and drag those. By default, it changes the radius of all the corners of the thing. If you hold Alt or Option, you can grab just one of them. So by holding Alt on my keyboard, I can select just this corner and drag that in. The other way to do this is if you're in Edit Object mode. Actually, that doesn't work. I can select the corner radius here with that point selected, click and drag across my screen, and that lets me go even further. Okay, this time we're not subtracting shapes, we're adding them together. So we want to combine two diamond shapes to make this more complex shape. So I'm making my frame and removing the fill here. So this shape, again, we could use the pen tool, but an easier way would be to start with a square and then rotate that square by hovering just outside the corner here. That lets me spin this object. If I hold Shift on my keyboard, it will constrain the angles that I can snap to. We just want to rotate it 45 degrees. You could also do that over here in the Properties panel. And we want two of these. Now, the trick here is instead of making another one, you can actually just copy paste as SVG. It's usually what you want. And you'll get another one of these. So again, I could copy, paste. I need to allow permissions. I get another one. This is one way to do it. If you're comfortable with that, that's totally fine. I really like using the shortcut of holding Alt or Option while I have my Move tool selected. And you'll see I get this second arrow behind my Move arrow. That means I'm about to duplicate whatever I click and drag on. So while I'm holding Alt first, now I'm going to click down, and then I'm going to move my mouse, and that creates another object of whatever I had selected. I'm going to change the color of this one just so you can see what's happening. And now we need to combine these shapes. Right now, they're two different shapes. We can do that with the union from the Boolean options. You can see that creates the union. Or with both of them selected, we can again use the Shapebuilding tool. And it does the same thing. Circle with part of it cut out. One thing that Figma has that I don't think Illustrator has yet is this arc tool. If you draw a circle, you do get a little circle in here and it says arc. I can actually click and drag on that to sort of decide how much of this sort of pie piece is filled in. So we could do it that way. The other way we could do it is by creating a square. Need to make that a little bigger. And then cutting this from the circle. Stars, we actually do have a tool for. And actually, I didn't put a frame here. Let me put a frame here. Okay. Stars, we do have a tool for. It's underneath our rectangle. I'm going to click and drag out from here. And you do have a couple options here. So you can see that I have these points that show up after I draw the star. This ratio is sort of how pointy or how fat those points are. So you can adjust that here. You can also see it's adjusting that over here in the Properties panel. And you can also change the radius and the number of points. So this is going to be how many points my star has. So you can create more like a burst effect. and then kind of edit these as you want to. But we want 5 points. So I'm going to change this back to 5. And there's our star. Overlapping circles with the center missing. This used to be much harder without the shape builder tool. I'm going to change the color of this so you can tell what's the template and what's not. I have one circle. I'm going to hold Alt or Option on my keyboard, click and drag over. And then what we want to do is actually cut this center out of these. So I'm going to hold Shift to select both, hit Enter on my keyboard, grab my Shape Builder tool, hold Alt or Option, and then click in the center. And you'll see that subtracts the center. Now, this doesn't combine our shapes, so we would actually need to use this Union tool up here, or we could try to combine them if you have enough of a bridge between the objects. So you'll see that did work to combine these into one shape. This one is just the opposite of this. It's tough to imagine at first, but you'll start to think in terms of the negative space between shapes. But if I draw 2 circles, you'll see that shape is what's left over if we get rid of what's on the outside. So that one's a little narrower, but it's the same idea. Looks like I made 2, so I'm going to delete one of those. Circle with triangles missing. We could do this by layering Pathfinder options on top of each other, but we could also do this just with the shape builder. Let me make my frame. So I have my circle. I need to make some triangles. And I can zoom in and out with the mouse wheel. If your Figma doesn't let you do this, come up here into Figma, go down to Preferences, and then make sure that, where is it? Use scroll wheel to zoom and right click to drag and pan. Make sure those are on. It makes navigating the canvas so much easier. So I have my triangle. I just need to make 2 copies of that. I'll click and drag to select all of them. You could also do that with Shift. Hit Enter, grab my shape builder and hold Alt or Option, and cut those triangles out of the circle. The very last thing I want to show you is how to export these into a common file format like a PDF or a PNG. So you can export things from over here underneath Export in the Properties panel. This will give you some options, but because we want to get all of these as PDF, there's an easier way to do it. So the first thing I'm going to do is click and drag across all of our frames to select them all, and then I'll click and drag to move these off of the templates just so we can see them. These didn't move because I have the layers locked over here. And then we want to add those fills back into the frames because they have to have a background or else it won't show up when we export. We could do that one by clicking on the frames and then adding a fill in, but we can also do it at the same time. So if I click and drag across all of these and then I hit add on fill, you'll see it does all of them at once. Once we've done that, we can come up here to the Figma menu, go to File, Export Frames to PDF. And once you hit export, this will give us a new downloaded file. This will export those locked layers as well, but after those, you will have the shapes that you made. So if I keep scrolling down, you'll see these are the ones that we worked on that are our own custom shapes.